Good evening. We're about to start what I promise is going to be a fascinating talk and fascinating event. So let me first acknowledge a few people here. I'm very glad and very honored to have here Alcibiades Stefanis, the former Deputy Minister of Defense of the Hellenic Republic and former head of the Greek military, the Ambassador of Chile, and the head of the cyberwarfare department at the Greek Ministry of Defense. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge my many colleagues who are here who are present here, and all our students. And I'll come to the speakers in a bit. But this is a hybrid event. This is how the future is going to go. So we have a live audience here and a distinguished one at that. But at the same time, we have multiple that audience online. And I think that is going to be fascinating. And we want to spread the word in this event and acknowledge Professor Simiti, yet another professor who is joining us. So let me, first of all, I'm going to introduce Ariel Levite, who is a friend of our department. This is not his first visit here. He has lectured here during, time flies, throughout the years, let us say, a long time. And we consider him part of our extended family. And we've also seen him while visiting Israel, pre-pandemic, that is. And I have to say, all of us today are in for a treat, because when you hear Mr. Levite, or Dr. Levite actually talk, it is fascinating and he makes you think. And I have a preview of his presentation. I've read it, so I guarantee that this is going to be fascinating. We have a distinguished panel here, and this is the creme de la creme in many ways. We have my mentor here, and let's say the Dean of Strategy in Greece, Professor Athanasios Platias. We have, in many ways, his intellectual successor, Professor Koliopoulos, who's actually joining our department on June 15th because we do headhunt. We have Professor Marilena Kopa, former member of the European Parliament, brilliant speaker, and I wish we could headhunt her as well, you know that. And we have a rising star who's a full professor, of course, Professor Laropoulos, who is he's the departmental resident expert on anything cybersecurity, and we all enjoyed his recent publications on the topic. But last but certainly not least, we have Ariel Levite. I mean, I have his CV here. If I read all of it, it's going to be 10 minutes. So I'll just give you it's a distinctive career. And for me, what is fascinating in this career, and it's not always the case with academics, because at heart he's an academic, but he's also a practitioner. And it's this combination of practice and theory that is rare. You have a lot of people who do a lot of theory, brilliant, and you have a lot of decision makers who are also brilliant. But how many manage to match the two seamlessly, easily, throughout long, distinguished careers? PhD from Cornell University, MA from Cornell University, BA from Tel Aviv University. That is, again, a very elite education. Ariel Levite is a non-resident Sierra Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program and Technology and International Affairs Program at the Carnegie Endowment. So you can Google how the Carnegie Endowment came to be. Very fascinating history. But that is, again, as good as it gets on a global level. The key, I think, things in his career, let me read out. Prior to joining the Carnegie Endowment in 2008, Levite was the Principal Deputy Director General for Policy at the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission from 2002 to 2007. He also served as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Defense Policy and was head of the Bureau of International Security and Arms Control, an Assistant Secretary position in the Israeli Ministry of Defense. I think so. We have Atomic Energy Commission. Of course, Israel does not officially have atomic weapons, but he was part of that. And the international, and his other position is akin to almost like sort of like a national security type type of position, very distinguished, very elite, elite education, elite positions. But, and this is where, for me, it gets really fascinating and interesting. As I said, I think at heart he's really an academic, if not primarily, also an academic. And he has numerous publications. In fact, I wish some of my colleagues had half of this level of publications. Just his more recent one, Israeli Strategy in Transition. This is a paper. Another one from Dream to Reality, Israel and Missile Defense, and so on and so forth. Very distinguished career. So, he's going to be lecturing today on reflections on cybersecurity in light of the Ukrainian conflict. So we have a major international event that has really transformed in many ways international politics. There's little doubt that we are at an inflection point when it comes to contemporary international politics. So what lessons can we deduce? In many ways, cybersecurity is the future. So it used to be land, air, sea, but now it's also cyber, and it's the whole, and space, yes. The whole idea of defense is rightly expanding, and I know the Greek military is on top of these developments, so I'm very proud of that, and very, we owe it to our great military personnel. But I want to find out what lessons can we learn, and I want to hear the comments, and maybe we'll have a little time for Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome once again our friend and member of our extended family, Dr. Ariel Levite, back to our department.
Thank you so much, Aris. You talked about headhunting. You're hired as my PR person. Watch out. All right. I want to start my presentation, but first of all, by thanking both the Department of International Relations and the Greek Council for International Relations for inviting me. But I'm really honored to see here General Stefanis, an old friend, in some ways also someone who whose conversation with General Stefanis where the rubber meets the road in terms of how the theories that we've been developing actually play out, not just in the Israeli context, but in the kind of issues Greece has to deal with. And I'm grateful to know that he's notwithstanding the fact that he's no longer with the Ministry of Defense or with the military, he's still on top of some of those most difficult issues that Greece has to deal with that we've been discussing. I want to thank Professor Platias, Professor Tsempiris, and so on. Obviously, I look forward to the comments from the panel more than I do to listening to myself, and so on. And thank you to the ambassador from Chile for joining the discussion. Let me start by making some introductory remarks to put things in context for you. So, the Ukraine conflict is obviously ongoing. Information about the cyber dimension is only available in bits and pieces. Some of it is not very accurate. And the parties are also learning from what they've gone through. So clearly it's very dangerous to offer definitive conclusions of what it is that we actually need to learn from this. Notwithstanding this necessary caution as an academic, I still would submit that there is some important things that we ought to think about following what we have already seen in a year for a couple of reasons. Number one, the cyber conflict in Ukraine did not start with the Russian invasion in 2022. It started at least in 2014, where the conflict actually escalated over the eastern part of Ukraine, but in fact some of it actually had even earlier antecedents. So that's one point to remember. So we're actually looking at a period of at least 9 years of a cyber confrontation. That's one. The second major reason that it's so important to look at this case is because it puts together, for the first time, a major cyber power in the form of Russia against a middle cyber power in the form of Ukraine. But again, on the side of Ukraine, you have significant assistance from Western powers. First and foremost, the UK and the US, also significant parts of NATO, but not in the least, some of the biggest technology platforms in the world have come to the assistance of Ukraine. So we really have two major cyber superpowers confronting each other over an extended period of time. And we can actually tell how the conflict actually changes once on the side of Ukraine you get the US, the UK, and the major international players that I've mentioned on the private sector. And I think, by the way, this is one of the most interesting issues since the article that I've written is available online for free, that's one of the policies that Carnegie has, and so on, thankfully. I want to go beyond the article that I've actually published very recently and give you something that I think is even more valuable for people interested in cyber warfare. So what you need to understand is, first of all, that my study is part of a series. There were 4 studies that we published, all of them available for free on the Carnegie website. And what sets apart my study from the others, it's a much more focused effort to try and look in general and generic insights. So here is what we thought originally about cyber warfare and cyber confrontation. Here is what is sort of exclamation marks and question marks that come to mind after we have seen this in play for some years with the major cyber powers and so on. And I would argue there are some really interesting issues. For those of you who have not expressed interest in this topic before, I recommend to you the book that we published in 2014 with 14 analogies to cyber conflict. And I'll give you a tip. The book is available, if you want to purchase it, from Georgetown University Press. But if you actually look at the Carnegie website, you can download it for free. This is one of the arrangements we made. So for students and beginners who want to understand what is the cognitive lens or cognitive lenses through which you can look at cyber warfare, this might be a useful way to go to. So the way I've structured the presentation, with thinking not just of very distinguished practitioners as we have here, mainly in the front row, but also for the students, is to ask 5 questions and try to answer them. The 5 questions are in front of you. Why does it seem that the Russians have failed and failed miserably? That's one. What is setting apart the way the US is approaching cyber warfare and the Russians are approaching cyber warfare? Because I think so many of us were wedded to the paradigm of the Americans, and I think that requires some revisiting. Point number 2. The third is, we have seen cyber warfare before a war, and we're seeing it during the war. And so the question is, how relevant is cyber warfare once war actually starts, as compared to what happens before the war starts, as compared to what we can expect once war ends? I want to ask a question, knowing this distinguished panel that has been assembled and the various areas of expertise and all the talent that you've been able to steal from Pantheon University and the ones that remains there, and the interest of lawyers. I want to actually look a little bit at the legal dimension of this issue and discuss what are the prospects that cyber conflict could actually trigger war and so on. And finally, some thoughts about that sets apart cyber actions from kinetic ones. So let me discuss very briefly each of those. I'm, as I said, eager to hear the panelists later, so I will just give you kind of an appetizer on each of those issues. Okay. So the impression is the Russians have largely been unsuccessful to translate cyber into anything beyond the tactical effectiveness. Is this picture that we're all seeing really accurate? And my argument that it's only partially accurate. And now let me go through the reasons. Yes, it's accurate to the extent that the Russians have planned for a very short war in the context of which cyber was supposed to enable for the Russians to, Russian conventional forces to take over Kiev, get rid of Zelensky, impose something in its stead. So the Russian purpose was not to destroy, it was not to produce a lasting effect, it was mainly kind of shock Ukraine and take over the country, put a different leadership and so on. So one has to understand what we are seeing against what the Russian war plans are. So that's point number one. And so the broader point that I want to convey here is that one has to see what role is cyber assigned in the context of war plans, rather than in abstraction. Point number one. Point number two is, as I've already alluded to, the Ukrainians were dealing with Russian cyber attacks going all the way to 2013 on an ever-intensifying scale. So the Ukrainians, notwithstanding the fact that they were a middle power on cyber, with some technology infrastructure, with some skilled workforce that was doing contract work for Western companies and so on, was actually getting very sophisticated in understanding and dealing with the Russians. And so that's another reason why what the Russians were trying to do did not come as a major shock to the Ukrainians, and was not come to Ukrainians that were totally unprepared for what the Russians were willing to accomplish, trying to accomplish. Point number two. Again, we have to put this in perspective and understand what happens if you actually catch someone completely by surprise, or you're actually dealing with someone that has been investing, as the Greek military and others, in some cyber defense. So that's point number two. But still, it's not just studying this, but actually day-to-day combat in the cyber domain between 2014 and 2022. The third is we have to understand something about cyber warfare that I won't go into great detail into, but maybe it's worth at least internalizing, which is when you want to achieve effects in cyberspace, you have to invest a lot of effort in preparations. You need to penetrate the adversary networks, create a permanent presence there so as to know what to touch, at what time and how, and trigger it at the right time. That activity inevitably leaves traces. And so even if you do not detect all of it, you detect some of it. And so the Ukrainian experience with the external help and so on was able to figure out in advance a fair amount of what the Russians were trying to do. So that's another reason to understand it. When you actually are trying to make sure that cyber would be the most effective, you're also in the process doing something that might undermine its effectiveness. One cannot overestimate the importance of external assistance. So we had the US Cyber Command literally fighting on behalf of Ukraine from at least October 2021 doing their defense. A massive amount from the UK as well, but once the fighting actually started, we had Microsoft and Amazon and Palantir and Starlink and so on, all coming to the rescue of Ukraine and doing a massive amount. Now imagine those are bigger and more powerful than many of the country's capabilities. I was recently talking to one major cyber power that is a member of NATO, and what they said was that in any future campaign planning, the number one issue would be, do they have to do it on their own? Or where will the tech platforms be, and so on? And even more importantly, can they count on them, or will it be improvised based on decisions individually made by corporations? Elon Musk would decide on day one that he wants to do it, and on day two give you the bill, and on day three tell you that he's no longer interested in doing so. So we're dealing here with a completely unexpected phenomenon, where we used to think country against country, and this is no longer the story. The story is fundamentally about where those independent players, some of them hired and paid by government, some of them wanting to enhance their reputation. For example, they wanted to show that the cloud reliance, the transfer all the data of Ukraine and the services to the cloud, it actually is giving you the resilience. So they came to the Ukrainian at their own expense. So you'd understand whether the Russians did not anticipate that the level of assistance, particularly if the conflict becomes prolonged, that those enterprises and so on. Clearly they didn't do it on day one, but some of them actually came to the Ukrainian rescue ahead of the conflict by telling them, if you want to protect the records of the driving license and the national statistics and so on, transfer it to the cloud. They did the transfer to the cloud. They passed a new law through the Ukrainian parliament, and so the data became protected through those companies and so on. Another issue to remember is that once you actually use what you have to try and repurpose the tools and capabilities that you have to another purpose in offensive. And so once the Russians failed in their original effort to try and get rid of Zelensky, to take over in Kiev and so on, the ability to repurpose cyber was much more limited than it is the case with conventional weapons. But there are two other issues that I want to underscore that actually are so important in understanding the picture. One is to understand the Russian priorities. So I mentioned already that the Russian priority for specific attack on Ukraine facilities was confined to try and incapacitate for a couple of days so they could take over Kiev, they replace the leadership and so on. But the Russians have also focused most of their cyber capability not to Ukraine. Half of it went into suppression in Russia, no domestic opposition. In fact, the most important cyber organ in Russia is the Internal Security Organization, it's the FSB. And the FSB #1 focus was internally within Russia, so there would be no trouble to President Putin when he decides to go into the war. And that remains the case. The FSB is the Internal Security Organization. Interestingly, by the way, Ukraine was part of the mandate of this Internal Security Organization. So you have to understand it's like the MI5 versus the MI6 in the UK and so on. So that's one. But the second part of the Russian effort, which involved the other organs of the state that do have significant offensive cyber capabilities, the military intelligence, namely the GRU, and the foreign intelligence, which is the SVR, they were both oriented in trying to basically penetrate Western Europe and put Europe on notice that if actually steps up to intervene directly to assist Ukraine, not indirectly, but directly, the Western Europe will go in flames. So you have to understand the Russian priorities. But finally, there is one more thing that emerges from all of this discussion, which is quite fascinating. And that is that it appears that digital networks, unlike conventional assets, are much more resilient. So they can recover much more quickly. And so the effects of cyber are largely temporary and mostly reversible. And so one should understand when you're trying to use cyber, what you can accomplish with it and what you can't accomplish with it, understanding that digital networks are relatively easy to reconstitute. So that's with respect to this issue. The second cluster of issues I want to discuss, and I will do it very briefly, is to say there is tremendous difference in the way the Russians approach cyber and the way the Americans approach cyber. While they do have something in common, there are nevertheless fundamental differences, which I don't think that everyone appreciated before. And the reason it's so important is because we all who have followed this area have been kind of led to think that the American way is the American way to go. It may not. Obviously, there is a European approach, which we'll hear a little bit later, which differs from both. But the point I'm trying to make to you is it's like that there are two very different approaches. So the #1 priority of Russia is domestic. To give you one example. That's not with the case with the most of the US cyber capability. The #1 purpose of the Russians is intelligence, to use cyber for intelligence purposes. Whereas the Americans have set up a military organization alongside the cyber intelligence organization that is supposed to perform military functions. It's a very different, in fact, in the Russian system, the military cyber component is actually quite modest and not the most sophisticated organ of their own. And it's not surprise, therefore, that the most capable organ in the Russian state that is actually doing offensive cyber is the Internal Security Organization. there is a big difference in what they want to accomplish. For the Russians, intimidation and subversion is the #1 goal. Some of it deterrence as well. Clearly, when we're looking at what happens in the US side, it's more around temporary incapacitation. For those of you who have not followed Russian thinking, the doctrine that the Russians have formulated, which is called reflexive control, which the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the Russian military, General Gerasimov, has said is on par with what happens on the conventional side. It's called reflective control. Basically, to use every means at Russians' disposal to manipulate how the adversary thinks. So not what he is capable of doing physically, but how they think. To dominate his thinking, to manipulate his thinking. This is the #1 goal of the Russian cyber activity. Not just the cyber, it's also the propaganda, it's also the diplomacy and so on. But this is kind of just to understand and so on. The Russians are much more focused on human elements in order to penetrate and instill the malware and so on than are the Americans in finding vulnerabilities. But perhaps the least expected element should have been the most expected element, namely the Americans deploy cyber warfare units with any of the deployed units. The Russians do exactly the same, but with electronic warfare units, not with cyber warfare units. And what the Russians have been able to do, where the electronic warfare units have actually been deployed after their routing from Kiev and so on, you may have seen the latest report about that the HIMARS rockets are being much, much less effective because of Russian electronic warfare capability. So the Russians are trying to achieve some of those results with very different capabilities and so on. But perhaps the biggest difference between Russia and the United States, which should be a lesson to us all. For the Russians, collateral damage is anywhere between irrelevant and desirable. If you try to be very precise in cyber operations, you have to put a massive effort into it to make sure that you get the results and you do not affect what you do not want to. For the Russians, this is irrelevant. It liberalizes their cyber operations and it makes them a lot more affordable and dangerous and so on. I want to sort of race ahead because there's so much material to cover. So just a couple of other thoughts that I think might be interest to you. We have seen 8 years of cyber confrontation before the war started, between 2014 and 2022. Cyber has been a very important component in those 8 years. In fact, most of the war had happened by cyber in those years. Not exclusively by the Russians, also by the Ukrainians. This was the main game. This is how you harass the Ukrainians, how you intimidate them, how you subvert, how you retaliate, and so on. And yet, what is absolutely remarkable, and I'll get to that in 2 or 3 minutes, is that it all happened below the level of an armed conflict. So there was a massive cyber campaign, including attacking critical infrastructure and so on. But it did not trigger a war. Moreover, as the Russian plans for a war picked up steam, the effort to try and do the cyber preparation for the war intensified dramatically. And that actually was what emitted a lot of the signals the Americans were able to pick and tell Zelensky and others, war is coming, look at what the Russians are actually planning to do. So although the physical forces did not really move it that much, the cyber preparations were very telling what goals the Russians were setting up for themselves. And so the head of the CIA was able to meet Zelensky, but also to meet Putin and tell him, we know what your game plan is. And then obviously also making it public. So very significant. The war, I've already said, the role of cyber was quite limited. And the reason for the Russians is very simple. If you can destroy something, why attack it by cyber? Why bother, right? If you no longer think that you can actually conquer the country, destroy it. So what the Russians are doing is destroying. You know, you use UAVs, you use rockets, you use artillery, you use sabotage, why bother with cyber? It is more of a lasting effect, it's more guaranteed to have that effect, and so on. And given that the outcry against their behavior is expected in any event, why bother to use cyber, sophisticated cyber against those targets? It's much more important to put Europe on notice in ways that do not explode than it is to use it in Ukraine, where you can actually use an alternative conventional weapon. So we need to understand that once war actually starts, cyber is relegated to a secondary function, more an auxiliary function, and so on. But the last point on this issue that I want to underscore is that once a ceasefire occurs in the conflict of the nature that we're seeing in Ukraine, other places in the Balkans, already and probably likely down the road, and so on, then conventional war will die and cyber war will pick up. So that's something to expect, unfortunately, in terms of what lies ahead. A big question that has been preoccupying lawyers for a long time is whether cyber can actually trigger a war. And the interesting observation is a lot of very offensive cyber operations have taken place, and no war has started as a result of cyber operations, notwithstanding attacking critical infrastructure repeatedly, hospitals, schools, electricity facilities, water, and things of that nature. So although there is a general consensus that international law somehow applies to cyber and so on, and that conceivably it could trigger a war, in practice the empirical evidence suggests that cyber, only in very extreme circumstances, could actually sort of produce escalation at the level that would trigger war. I'm mentioning this as an important thing because I think NATO now in particular is struggling with the question of can one nevertheless deter some particularly egregious activity that would constitute an armed attack or a warlike action and so on, and that's still an open issue. But what is really finally on this issue to underscore is that we have seen that the same principles that we thought are characteristic of international law of armed conflict, namely that you need to exercise proportionality and to avoid affecting non-combatants and so on, do not really affect the way some parties, Russia, Iran, others, are actually conducting in themselves in the cyber war domain. Final point I want to make, and that's where I'm going to wrap up, is what sets apart cyber actions from kinetic one. And I've already given away some of the answers. So quickly, one big difference is it's much easier to predict effects in a conventional operation than it is from a cyber one. And what I mean predict is that you will actually achieve what you want, and you won't achieve what you do not want. The effects of cyber could cascade, but the cyber side might actually be more resilient than you anticipated. So on many of those levels, cyber actions are less predictable in their effects than their conventional ones. The second I've already talked about, namely that the effects of conventional operations are more definitive, enduring, whereas the cyber ones are more short-term and largely reversible, and so on. The level of preparedness that you require in order to be effective with cyber operations is huge. It requires the expertise, it requires the advanced preparations, it requires penetration of adversary networks, the mapping, and so on, and the maintenance of those capabilities, so you know that you will have a chance of actually producing an effect even when war starts. So it's not just that you have an aircraft or a sort of airplanes or navies or whatever and so on, and they're kind of multi-purpose and they can deploy it on a short notice and so on. To whatever can be done in cyber in these areas on an improvisation is likely to be much less effective than the conventional interpretation. Another very big difference, very deep and very profound one, is it's very difficult to interpret what is the intention behind those who perpetrated the action. So you see the adversary doing something. Is he preparing to defend himself against for example, the American doctrine calls for penetrating adversary networks so they can defend better. But when you are the Chinese and you're seeing the American penetrating your networks, what are you supposed to think? That they're preparing for defense, they're preparing for offense, they're collecting intelligence. It looks the same. They're trying to communicate to you a message. What is your intention? Very difficult to tell. Whereas if you actually tell someone to fire at somebody, you know that there was something, you know, particularly on a sustained basis.
And we usually go for the worst case assumption.
Exactly, exactly. Perhaps the most dramatic aspect, and the one that I think Greece ought to be prepared for, is the number one principle. Professor Platias may disagree with me here and there and so on. That's how we keep our friendship. I would argue that one of the most important principles in conducting a war, and he will immediately come with examples from the Peloponnesian Wars and so on, is that you want to contain the battle space. So they define where war will actually take place. It's much more difficult to do in cyberspace. So when the Russians went after some of the Ukrainian telecommunications through on satellites, the effects were felt all the way to the UK. So whereas we have an occasional thing where a rocket or a bomb and so on falls on Polish territory and so on, in cyber, the thing spreads well beyond, so it becomes very difficult. But I've also pointed out that the intervention of so many parties, the Microsofts, the Amazons, the Palantir and so on, says, how can you control the battle space when it's actually global? Here. And that's the role of Excel. And finally, and as a final note, I would say the following. What I tried to tell you at the beginning of the presentation was that a hell of a lot depends on what you consider the metrics of success. What is the metrics of victory in this confrontation in cyber? And a hell of a lot depends on, do you really care for values, that you do not attack non-combatants, or you do not produce the sort of disproportionate damage? For some people, if you do cause these, you have lost. For the Russians, this is not a relevant metric at all. One example. Another example is, are you looking for to dissuade, or are you looking to persuade? And so on and so forth. There is a whole discussion in the paper on some aspect of this, but I would argue that a hell of a lot of future discussion will have to be not just on the academic level, but on the plenar's level. What would you consider success? What you consider failure? And what will merely end up with a big yawn? Thank you for listening so attentively.
Well, it's really a pleasure listening to Dr. Levite. 43 years ago, we were together at Cornell as graduate students, so I can see that he maintains his vigor, energy, charisma, and charm after 45 or 43 years. He's still the same. So delighted to have you, Eli, here. For our students, it was a superb introduction to one dimension of multi-domain warfare. War is not just in the land, the air, or the sea. It's cyber and it's space. So today we hear the dimension that it's cyber. Now, we'll turn into the discussion, and I will give the floor to Professor Koliopoulos. And I will make a point that Dr. Levite and Professor Koliopoulos are connected. How? When Dr. Levite finished his dissertation on strategic surprise, Professor Koliopoulos was graduating from Pantheon and looking for a subject matter for his own dissertation. So he decided either to validate or disvalidate the conclusions that Professor Levite produced. So actually he structured his dissertation on precisely this question. Was Levite right on strategic surprise? So, was Levite right in his analysis of cyber warfare, Konstantinos?
Now, that's fun. Brings me back something like, yeah, it was exactly 30 years ago. My goodness. Anyway, So, it was really spot on. I was fascinated, and now actually I would like to ask two questions. I don't know whether I'm actually permitted, but anyway. So, the first one.
Free country, you're permitted.
Okay.
Everything goes.
Okay. There are definitely some time constraints we need to think about. Anyway, so. Is cyber warfare any different from traditional acts of subversion, espionage, sabotage that have been going on for millennia? Is there any qualitative difference? This is my question, because it seems to me that is, and I have been reinforced in this opinion of mine by listening to your presentation, that it is only the means that matters. It's only, the means that differs. There is no qualitative difference. So all this hype about cyber war, in the end of the day, is just that, hype. Things that have been going on, as I said before, for millennia, just conducted by a different way. You said, and I'm also fascinated, I've been fascinated by Russian military thought, okay? So, because it's a very essential part of strategic theory. So, I've just learned a few minutes ago that the Russians are trying to effectuate the same results as the Americans do with other means, with plain old electronic warfare, and have been reasonably successful in this. So, the second question is whether, how would you assess the relative effectiveness of the Russian and the American approach to cyber warfare? If it can be assessed, because you ended your speech with this very apt observation about the metric of success. I mean, how do you actually measure success? And then you have this, this fellow asking you, how do you actually do this?
I expected a friend to pose me difficult questions, and you have, so thank you. Let me give you two partial answers, because I think that the issues call for a much longer and more exhaustive debate, which I invite you to, and so on. We could have fun. I think that the biggest difference at the end of the day between cyber and whatever else we've seen is the cascading effects. So, you know, when you use conventional arms, unlike, by the way, nuclear weapons, it's a very localized effect, direct effect. There may be indirect effect. For cyber, the cascading effects is the number one issue. To give you an example, the Americans, presumably with some assistance from the Israelis, had conducted a major cyber campaign against Iranian enrichment program. And the way it was done was to instill some viruses into the Iranian centrifuges, okay? And it was, the way this was done was to do those worms inside sort of a Siemens software. It didn't take very long for the whole thing to spread all over the world. The sophistication of the operation was that although it spread, where else it ended up did not trigger the same incapacitation effects that it did and so on. But that required an incredible degree of sophistication. So the point that I want to make is that I think the biggest thing is, can you bound the effects? And my argument is, in cyber, it's extraordinarily difficult to do. Because anticipating where it's going to end up and how, in fact, in order to be more effective, you actually need to give some of the cyber capabilities a propagating features. And the propagating features that are designed to enhance the effect are actually the ones who are producing the cascading effects. So that's one big difference that I think the logic is the same. Some of the way it plays out is different. I already, I think, alluded to the fact that I think there are, which you picked up on these kind of measures of success and the relative effectiveness and so on. I would argue the following. I think the Russians have largely been successful, if I understand what the logic that is guiding them, so we always have to be careful here, but if I understand the logic that is guiding them, which they have discussed at length, namely the reflexive controls, you could see to this day the impact that they have had on the UK Brexit the debate, the effect that they've had on the US elections in the past and so on. So if what you want really is to try and undermine trust, the Russians have been very good at it, very good at it, and so on. If you actually try to assess how successful have they been in their deterrence through cyber, I would submit, and for those of you who are interested in the topic, I strongly recommend to you a report that was issued by Microsoft on March 15th. And the report gives strong evidence of the level of effort the Russians are now putting, not only into subversion in places like Moldova and other places in Eastern Europe, but also the effort they're now directing at all of Europe, with emphasis on Western Europe, to basically put NATO on notice that if they become more directly involved in the crunch time at Ukraine, war will spread beyond Ukraine. And we can't be definitive in our conclusions, but nevertheless, I think the message had sunk. And for a lot of people who wonder why the Americans have been cautious to provide Ukraine with certain capabilities, but not to provide them others, to oppose the transfer of modern aircraft, for example, and whatever other things they've provided to do it more slowly and so on. I think one of the issues is that the message had sunk, that if the war actually becomes war in which NATO is more involved, there is a remote prospect, but nevertheless one that could be dismissed, that the Russians would escalate to nuclear weapons. And one step before that, they will try to set Western Europe on fire. And I'm unfortunately a pessimist, that I think that if we are going for the crunch time in Ukraine this spring and summer, the #1 Russian goal using cyber and other means would be to set on fire Moldova and some other places in the Balkans. And so would they be successful given that their intentions are now clear and picked up? We don't know. But at least the prospect is focusing the minds that it's much easier to destabilize with you cyber than to actually stabilize with cyber.
What would setting on fire mean?
Setting on fire means create political instability, #1. Political instability, I would argue. If they can actually take it to the next level and having the people they support take over, even better. If they trigger a civil war, major confrontations, considerable distrust in the regimes that do stay in power and so on, but have to confront implacable domestic confrontation, I think that is very likely scenario now, because the Russians feel that if the battle remains exclusively confined to Ukraine, they're not going to win. So they need to get the West to worry a great deal that this is going to get out of hand, and therefore they have to put a pressure on the Ukrainians. That's my prediction.
Well, in the introduction of Professor Tsabiris said that Dr. Levite combines theory with practice. That's true for Professor Marlena Kopa from Padua University, that is teaching comparative politics there, but she has spent time in the European Parliament and has become, over the years, one of the top, if not the top, Greek expert on European security. Marlena.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your fascinating presentation. I've read the article. I took tons of notes. I really thank you very much. I learned a lot. Let me start from the last point. I worked for many years on the Balkans. I totally agree with you. But then we have to ask who is responsible to stop it. And it's the EU. And the EU is blind to all these that Russia does in the Balkans during the recent years, because we know where the problem is. It's in Bosnia, in Republika Srpska, it's in Serbia. They tried to undermine Prespas agreement in North Macedonia. We know what happens. And instead, for the EU to move ahead with the accession process, they let the region in limbo. So if chaos comes in our neighborhood, we know who the responsible would be. Now, my first point on what you said, which was fascinating when you compared the American with the Russian approach to cyber warfare. And reading your article, you say that maybe it's because Russia is an authoritarian regime and authoritarian regimes usually do this. I was thinking of another element that could be of importance in this difference of explaining that this is culture, and the relationship between culture and security goes back to Thucydides. I have the two major experts here, and I think they would agree with me. So it's the idea of strategic culture, and I looked my books and I found the term used by Jack Snyder in 1975 in a report on American aviation, where he noted that US analysts failed to predict Soviet reactions to deterrence policy. This happened, he claimed, because they presumed that the Soviets would react the same way as Americans. The question he tried to address is why the two nations reacted differently regarding nuclear threat, and then he argued that citizen socialization takes place through a particular Soviet way. So my question would be, could we add culture as a way of explaining? And coming to Europe, has a Europe approach of its own? I say no. And if I continue on this line of thinking, I would say it's because we have national responses, but not really apart from documents, cybersecurity strategy, defense policies. And you know, when the EU cannot solve a problem, it creates institutions and produces documents, unfortunately. That's what we do. So we don't have an EU strategic culture. And President Macron, since 2017, has put the finger on this very essential point. Can we have a common security and defense policy without an EU strategic culture? And the first question is exactly this. If we can consider culture as an element of explaining. Now, my second comment is about the EU and the attacks of Russia. EU has, since February 24 in 2022, has been a target of Russian attacks. I have noted Baltic countries have been the target of 157 attacks, Poland 117, Nordic countries 95, Germany 58, France less exposed, only 14 attacks. But the latest victim was some weeks before the French National Parliament. And it's sure that it came from Russia's side. They have not only increased in quantity, but also in quality. And as you said, it's not always easy. What is the threshold of war? But they create a great strain on infrastructure and, of course, on decision makers. And I would like to add that cyber operations with a military purpose account to only 2% of these attacks recorded in the EU in recent months. So we could identify them mainly as systematic harassment. I think this would be a more accurate way. Now, Ukraine was a major shock. Ukraine in 2014, because I think that's when everything begins. Because it gives us a new definition of war and of the acts of aggression. And it was also the moment that it became clear that Russia would be the strategic problem of the following period, setting Meanwhile, new standards in cyber warfare, targeting everything from election, health system, political parties, and critical infrastructure. And you know, and I will end by this last comment, that cybersecurity brought closer EU and NATO, because you are well aware that EU and NATO have many problems to work together because of Turkey and of the problem of Cyprus. So cybersecurity were on the rare areas where during recent years, since 2016 was the first joint declaration, 2017, and now some weeks before 2023, third declaration, focused mainly on cyber operation. Do you think that this can really be something that will help these two institutions come closer, or it's just only one issue and it will, they will stick to that? Thank you so much.
Marlena, you are such an expert on some of those issues. By the way, I was thinking of metric success. How come University of Piraeus was not able to attract you and left you at the Pantheon and so on?
Yes.
So
we tried.
So that's about the measure of success. I will put in front of you another measure of success. My hidden agenda, and we don't talk neither to my hosts here nor to a distinguished gentleman that is sitting here on the first floor, is to convince some of the brightest students in University of Piraeus that this field of activity represents the future and the present, and they need smart brains to help confront this, because this is the current and perhaps one of the most important areas of conflict in the future. So they need bright minds. For those of you who want to submit their applications, here is someone to give it to. But now to the specific issues you've raised. I have no doubt that culture is as you pointed out, is indeed an important factor here. What I'm struggling with are actually 2 points here. One is how much of it is history as distinct from culture. I don't know that this is such an important distinction to make, but what I'm saying is, I think that when one tries to understand the Russian behavior, history is a very important guide. Is that culture? Is that experience? Is that structure? Yeah, I don't know how to sort of, but there is definitely something that you touch which is extremely important. They approach things differently based on it and so on. But I want to point 2 other things with respect to culture that you've highlighted that I think are very important. We talked about Russia. We didn't talk about China. And China may be the #1 issue going forward. And it's no doubt that the Chinese think about it more in terms that are akin to the Russian way of thinking than to the American way of thinking. The Russians and the Americans think of cyber warfare, and the Chinese and the Russians think about informatized warfare, where information is what you fight over. And that therefore weaves together propaganda and information and public relations and other things of that nature and so on. Is that a cultural differences? Yes, to some extent. It's also a strategic difference. So, I'm just, given that you highlighted culture, I want to take this in a slightly different direction, which is culture is also what you're trying to conduct a war over. When you now look at the Russian behavior in Ukraine, the effort by the Russians, not only to transfer into Russia tens of thousands of Ukrainian kids who are then being indoctrinated in Russia. I mean, one of those sort of crimes against humanity that the Russians are being accused of. The effort of Russia to integrate the Russian Orthodox Church into the campaign in Ukraine, right? Not just to legitimize.
It's nuclear strategy.
Yeah, not just to legitimize the war, but also every area that they've liberated, they deploy bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church to reorient the population. So we actually have here a culture war that the Russians are engaging in. I defer to you on everything that has to do with Europe. I must confess that I'm as puzzled as one can be about what's happening in Europe, and I think you gave some answers which are more, for me, a lot of food for thought. I would highlight one issue that I found striking, and particularly as an Israeli, but not exclusively as an Israeli. Israel has come forward with a term that is called the war between the wars. Professor Platia sometimes referred to this as hybrid warfare, or whatever it is that we're talking about. Europe assumes that there is war and no war. There is kind of like a binary situation. But that's not the situation you find yourself in. And what you have described in terms of Russian behavior in various parts of the region that are closer to you, but also beyond this, the Russians do not see this that way. For the Russians, there is an ongoing struggle. They have convinced themselves that they're under siege, whatever, and so on. They should use all the means at their disposal, all the time, and not just wait until war breaks out and so on. In fact, they're much better off without war breaking out, and they conducting those operations and so on. And I think, therefore, that the point that you've made, citing President Macron, I'm not sure that citing President Macron always translates into the best recipe for getting the Germans on board, let alone the Poles and others, or the Baltics and so on. But I would say, yes, the biggest cultural difference that I think is to do away with this dichotomy and understand that you're involved in an ongoing struggle where you need to use all the instruments at your disposal, grand strategy level, in order to, on the one hand, in some areas appease, in other words, deter, and in other areas prevail over the adversary. And I think that's the change of heart that because when I look at the European cyber forces, unlike the Americans, unlike the Russians, unlike the Israeli, unlike the Chinese and so on, most of them are kind of reserve capacity to be activated in wartime. Right? Is that appropriate given what we're seeing? I wonder. So all of you need to submit your CVs here to the gentleman in the front row. Yes, thank you.
Well, Dr. Levite, we are subjected to hybrid warfare from Turkey in the recent years, so we know this game which you call war between wars. We live it here in Greece. Professor Learopoulos, which is our expert on hybrid warfare, but also on cyber warfare in the department. Your take.
Thank you, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. We have a great scholar on cyber warfare. I read your book and your paper, and I have to constrain myself in only 3 general comments. So what I'd like to do is stress 3 things that I think very broadly define a lot of things about cyber warfare and the take you had on the case of Ukraine. The first, and you slightly mentioned that in the beginning, is how we treat with, let's say, the lack of data on cyber warfare, cyber security. There are a lot of things that we do not know, so we don't have enough, let's say, hard evidence. But the second take on that is how we treat and how we conceptualize even the data we have. And I'd like to give some examples. I mean, how do we understand the linkage between cyber and kinetic operations? Meaning that should we perceive cyber operations as an equivalent to kinetic? Or should we rather think about the enabling effects of cyber activities rather than whether they are a substitution? A second example, how would we analyze, for example, the spillover effect of a cyber operation that involves the use of malware? Would we say that, simply we lost control of the operation, or is it, let's say, a deliberate attempt to escalate? Professor Levite mentioned that earlier. How can we understand who is behind the cyber operation? And I'm not only referring to attribution, which is one of the biggest obstacles in cybersecurity, but, for example, how can we attribute a cyber attack on the FSB or the GRU, whether it's orchestrated by one or the other intelligence agency, and how can we say whether a cyber attack has been orchestrated by a state-sponsored criminal network? I think that very briefly these examples illustrate the difficulty we have to understand when we try to conceptualize warfare. And my second point is, and Professor Kaliopoulos slightly mentioned that as well, is really how we conceptualize warfare. I know maybe in the beginning it's going to sound very academic, but trust me, it's not. There is an ongoing discussion, and Professor Levite is part of this discussion, on how we actually understand war in general and cyber war in our case. So let's say, just putting some ideas out there, somebody actually said, cyber war is only useful as a metaphor, it's not a real war. So is it a real war? Does it fulfill, for example, the Clausewitzian criteria of lethality and instrumentality? How broadly do we define, or how narrowly do we define cyber war? I mean, do we think of cyber war being everything that happens in or through cyberspace? That could be web defacement, that could be something like WikiLeaks, that could be the operational limit games in Iraq, and many other things, or up to something that damages, for example, critical information infrastructure. If a concept is very broadly defined, then I think it loses its analytical value. So we have to keep that in mind. If we restrict cyber war only to, let's say, a case of a major catastrophic attack against critical infrastructure, then we're still looking for one case out there that fulfills this criterion. How do we read the effects of cyber operations? And Professor Levite mentioned that as well. Do we understand cyber operations mainly in disruptive or destructive terms? Do we perceive, like mainly the US and the West is doing, cyber warfare as something that is very data-oriented about the integrity of computer networks and the confidentiality of data? Or do we perceive it as something that has a very strong cognitive element, as a societal/cognitive type of warfare, where you emphasize on perception management and you fight for the so-called hearts and minds of the targeted audience? As I said, I don't think this is an academic exercise. It has implications in strategic operation and legal terms. And since you touched very briefly on the legal dimension, again, what do we consider equivalent to an armed attack or the use of force out there in cyber terms? How do we apply criteria of the law of armed conflict, like necessity, proportionality, and discrimination in relation to cyber operations? There's the approach, for example, of the so-called effect-based approach. So we don't care about what the mean is, whether it's a kinetic mean or a non-kinetic cyber mean, we just care on the effect. So if you deny me my capabilities to do something, I consider it a use of force, armed attack, etc. But that's an idea. It's not something that the international community has accepted so far. And we also referred about hybrid and cyber in many ways. If we think about this, if it's not clear when we are in a state of war, what is an act of cyber war, it's not clear the lines are not clear between war and non-war, or whether you call it pre-war, or whether you call it peace or even unpeace. So this explains up to a point the utility and range of all those cyber operations conducting during peacetime. And as you said, obviously the Russians don't care about these time differences, whether it's war or peacetime. It's a constant, let's say, battle. Or you could say, it's a death by 1,000 cuts in a way. And going to Russia, since obviously it's one of the main parties in the conflict, it's, in a way, I know it's going to sound a bit strange at the beginning, it's not really fair to judge Russians under the cyber whatever terminology, because the funny thing is, and I'm sure Professor Levite knows that, they don't even use the term cyber. They refer to the cyber terminology only when they refer to how the West is approaching cyberspace. They use all this info, whatever terminology. They refer to information sphere, to the information domain. So they look cyber as a part, maybe an important one, of a broader conceptualization about controlling information, both in the domestic terms and the, let's say, external terms. So as Professor Levite mentioned earlier, there's a huge difference on how the US and mainly many Western countries conceptualize the use of, let's say, the cyber option, mainly in let's say, technical terms. The Russian approach is, I'm not saying it's better, it's obviously different. They see the cyber element as something of a broader, let's say, information campaign. So when we, discuss and think and try to conceptualize and measure the effectiveness of the Russian whatever info/cyber operations, we have to keep that in mind, because on the Russian mindset, there is also, if I might say, a battle for the internal audience, as you said, one of major developments, the way I see it, was RUNET, something they came up back in 2016 in the information security doctrine, being able to actually cut off, in a way, the Russian network from the global internet, and all the whatever information/influence operations they're doing out there. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And I'm saying all this because it raises a lot of questions of how we understand the Russian actions, but also cyber war in general. And the third point I want to raise, and again, you slightly raised it, maybe you'll be willing to offer some thoughts on that, is the role of the private sector. And I'm not referring to the third parties, meaning the hacktivists or criminal networks, but the case of Ukraine is kind of, in a way, unique because we saw all those private mega companies, whether it's Microsoft, patching critical vulnerabilities, Starlink, Cloudflare, Palo Alto, many others that you mentioned, they had a strong presence on what happened and still happening in Ukraine in terms of protecting. So to me, it raises a lot of questions. You have something like a private IT army. So I'm speaking generally, not only about Ukraine, lessons learned. Should state empower the private sector to take on security and defense? Again, this blurs the lines between what the government is supposed to do and what the industry is doing out there. Is it a good idea for somebody, I mean the state obviously, to rely, to depend, maybe depend too much on the private sector? Because of a dependency is also a form of vulnerability. In case, and I'm not an expert on international law, I'm just saying, but how should we treat those actors, those players, in case of a cyber war in terms of the law of armed conflict? Obviously, industry is driven by market forces, not altruism or national interest or patriotism. So should we really, emphasize on that or not? And my final point was very, in a way, oversimplistic. The way I understand the cyber option, as you said, as one of the many elements obviously somebody could use, it depends every time on what your political purpose is, what your enemy is, who your enemy is, what are his vulnerabilities and his strong points, whether you want to utilize, let's say, to the extreme the cyber option, or as you said, why hack it if I can destroy it and if I don't care about collateral damage. So this, in a way, is my take on your paper and your presentation. Looking forward for your comments.
He needs at least an hour, the counter lecture, to answer these questions, but give it a try.
I think some of the questions you raise so profound that we indeed need a very quiet room to discuss. Let me take the point that you've raised and kind of try repackage them for a second in order to be able to deliver some semi-coherent response quickly. And take us in a couple of directions. So point number one I would make for the broader audience is, look, we've had a digital transformation. Much of our life now occurs in the digital world rather than in the physical world. With the digital transformation occurs where crime was mostly occurring in the physical world, it migrated a lot of it to the digital world and so on, and so did warfare. Okay, so point number one, we all now have mobile phones that are individualized, we have social networks, this has become anywhere from where political campaigns are being conducted, all the way to where warfare, and clearly and in between you have crime. This is also where the marketing takes place. And my son and my son-in-law are both in this game. They're in, except for marketing purposes. Not in warfare, in all kinds of applications on football and things of that nature. So the digital transformation has profoundly changed our lives, and one manifestation is how it plays out in warfare. So that's point number one. We have to understand that it comes with the whole transition to the digital world. First. Second, I think it's very useful to look at the American conceptualization of cyber warfare in one respect. That if you look at the U.S. Army manuals, you would see that's the doctrinal documents of the U.S. Army. For purposes those who are not familiar with them, they actually talk about 3 levels of impact. the physical world, the logical world, and the cognitive world. Okay, so what we're really looking at, if only the digital, the electrons are only affecting computers and telecommunication, everything stays in your digital world, in the logical world. All right? I want to incapacitate your computer. I want to manipulate your computer. I want to manipulate your communication. All of this is in the electronic world, in the logical world. However, we have also seen efforts to try and use those to make sure not only that there's a result of losing your computer, your electricity generation capacity, and so on, through paralyzing your computers, other physical effects will occur. So that's point number 2. But number 3 is, indeed, I want to influence your decision making. I want to understand, to influence your situational awareness. And I think that in all of those areas, the ones that the Chinese and the Russians have taken to furthest is indeed in this effects on the cognitive world. And precisely under this interpretation of informatized or information warfare rather than cyber warfare is the conception. But you have to understand, this is not just a game of dictatorship or authoritarian regimes and so on. Those are particularly effective in trying to use censorship to block adversary information, to shut down internet access on the one, and sort of in addition to that, to offer propaganda. Instead, President Xi is explaining to the Chinese media that its role is not to inform, but to educate and to indoctrinate. He's visiting the media organizations of China and explaining to them that that is their role. This is not part of a warfare. This is part of a conception that information could break or break the regime. And clearly there is also behind it a fear that there will be subversion through this and so on. So that's why I think that the concept that General Gerasimov had put forward as the reflexive control is so germane to our understanding to the issue we need to focus on. How manipulation of the cognitive dimension has become a day-to-day type of challenge for us to manage and so on. And by the way, for those of you who think that I'm only talking about some regimes, if you want to see what happened yesterday in a province of India where civil war is underway between tribes, the number one thing that the Indians done is to cut off the internet. They had done it in Kashmir before. They're doing it, and for months. This is a democratic country and so on, but they believed that the number one thing that the government ought to do in order to stabilize the regime is to cut off internet access. Notwithstanding the economic effects, the social effects, and so on, for people who become totally dependent on the digital world in order to manage themselves. Finally, let me offer one thought about it that I think is the area that indeed is quite profound in terms of the role of presumably independent players that are non-states. I think you touched on a really, really important issue, and you added one dimension that I didn't cover in my original remarks, which I should have. So here's the thing. Those who have watched the Ukrainian conflict had seen that the Ukrainians had something called the Ukrainian Internet Army of volunteers. But those who had followed it closely would see that very recently the Ukrainians formally made this army of volunteers into formal part of the Ukrainian government, of the Ukrainian army. Okay? Now, we're clearly more sympathetic to what the Ukrainians have done than what the Wagner group is doing in Russia. But fundamentally, they're not that different in terms of the conceptualization. So you have all kinds of independent players with some kind of an interesting relationship with the state, where in order to give the state more elbow room to operate in, you create some kind of a relationship where you give those players some tools and you look the other way when they actually use this. By the way, for those who are wondering, a hell of a lot of cybercrime came from Ukraine until 2022. Mm-hmm. And those same skills became patriotic and harnessed against Russia and then finally integrated into the Russian warfare and so on. So, and that's Russia. But when you look at it from Russia, they're saying, what are we doing differently than the American contractors? I think it is different. But I'm just pointing out to you that there are those who look at it and saying, everyone is now using contractors. And the reason is, as you precisely pointed out, was how can you point out that these were direct organs of the state that were dividing the loots? And in fact, the reason I go back now to my original recommendation that you should look at the 14 Analogies book that we had done, because I think that the most interesting chapter is the chapter that deals with privateering, the corsairs, and so on historically. Those were, for several hundreds of years, where the maritime domain was terrorized by these guys, but some of them with a formal royal decree and division of the spoils. So in essence, this is, as you pointed out, how much of it is new? I would say no, it's a historic. Professor Platias has mentioned to me on the side conversation the Dutch East India Company, or the East India Company, or the Dutch equivalent, and so on. Those were independent empires, commercial on the one hand, but with some collaboration of the state. So in essence, what we're seeing is the return of history, not just a deviation from history, playing out in the digital space, because the digital space is now so important to everyone's life. Let me stop here.
Well, let me use the moderator's privilege to make a couple of comments before I open for discussion. I mean, for confusion, we don't need only the Russians to do it. It's precisely what Twitter and Facebook are specializing on. I mean, confusion can be built on the algorithms. Confusion about truth, what's happening and what is happening, it's over here. It is being used for commercial purposes. Of course, the Chinese or the Russians capitalize on it, but it's part of the digital domain. I mean, the social media and the algorithms that are programmed, that's what they do. Now, let me make two comments. Using the triangle of Clausewitz, in war you have the government, you have the military, and you have the society. And apparently, cyber warfare is happening on these three levels. But in your previous work, you have done a lot of work of society-centric warfare. So could you make the connections for us between how it's being used for cyber-centric warfare? And the second comment has to do with the instigation of war, the outbreak of war. You mentioned that so far we did not have a case that cyber instigated war. Well, let me try to give you a plausible future scenario. There is a crisis in South China Sea or in Taiwan. And during the period of crisis, there's a cyber attack on Chinese infrastructure, Chinese communication, and the Chinese are fearing that the communications between the political leadership and the nuclear forces or the military leadership are being hacked or disabled. Don't you see a kind of preventive mode, Dr. Strangelove doomsday type of scenario coming out of the situation that I just described?
My expectation was, as a friend, you won't ask me difficult questions. I mean, what can I do? Okay. But now that you have, I need to answer them. Let me try. And I will get even later. Okay. So, I actually have three responses to Professor Platias here. The first is to say, yes, I think that the concept of trust is the number one commodity that is challenging us. And who do we trust? What do we trust? What do we distrust? How we handle? What criteria we use to trust and distrust? Particularly some human frailties that were manifest. You know, first impressions are very difficult to change, and so on. It is so important, particularly when you do not interact physically with people. You're actually intermediate through a digital means. So, and when we had, let's say, media channels, printed journalism, at least there were some editors. And those editors were important, were at least had some responsibility to sift fact for fiction and to uphold themselves some kind of a responsible policy. And moreover, the information was not brutally oriented to actually give you only what you wanted to hear and not things that you did not want to hear. And I think that's the biggest issue we are now dealing with the information space. That the algorithms that have been developed have become echo chambers. There is no screening. I think the Americans have taken it furthest, worryingly, in terms of giving the digital platforms complete freedom from any liability in terms of their editing and so on. Now they're trying to claw back. Europe, as you pointed out, I think is actually one area where Europe has been ahead and trying to impose some, both on privacy and other things and so on, with mixed success, but at least a lot further than the US has been with Section 230 and the effort to. So I think clearly the issue of trust is here, is germane, and I think you touched it. But this leads me to the second point that came up, and I think both in yours and in the preceding presentation. Yes, cyber-centric warfare is merely one dimension, as I see it, in a broader societal confrontation of what we call society-centric warfare, where precisely because conventional war is now more rare and more limited in scope and so on, we haven't given up as humanity, as people, as countries and so on confrontations, but we try to conduct them below the level of a military confrontation as much as we can. And even when we engage in a military confrontation, after the first phase where the conventional means are decisive, you actually have three audiences that you need to confront with. You have your own society to retain its support and mobilization. And by the way, those who have not paid attention over the news of the last 24 hours, now the Russians are not only taking the prisoners, but they're also trying to get Tajiks and others to be part of the Russian war effort. So clearly the more war persists, you need to draw into other sectors of society that initially you thought were irrelevant for the confrontation. So that's one audience, when you talked about audiences earlier. The second audience is the adversary. You're trying to manipulate, but the adversary, in this case, you're mostly trying to tell the European society, if we look at Ukraine, that it's not worth the effort because they will have higher inflation and cooler winters and possible conflagration in other areas, and that try to promote this war fatigue. So that's number two. And number three, you're trying to convince. So you're trying to convince the Ukrainian society, but also trying to convince the third parties. And if you look at, by the way, the amount of effort the Russians are using on African countries and Asian countries in the context of Ukraine, not to side with Europe, not to side with the United States and so on, you understand that we're dealing here with a global conflict where the society aspect is the germane one. Let me deal now with the last question, which I think is the most difficult in some ways to come to grips with. Is it possible that there will be circumstances in which cyber attacks would trigger war? And I think what you had alluded to was not just a war, but I mean a war that could be a nuclear war and so on. We had done a study that is available. If you look at the Carnegie website, there is a study on that issue that we've done on America and China in this context, the cyber-nuclear nexus. There is clearly a significant anxiety about the scenario that you talked about. Particularly if you think that some of your capabilities are vulnerable to, let's say, a cyber-first strike that could undermine whatever it is, second strike capability or whatever it is and so on. One of the things that we had tried to do, in the interest of stability, was to highlight some measures that these parties could actually take to buffer themselves from that kind of an impact. So even if the problem, just to on the one hand to expand what Professor Protias had said, and on the other hand to bound it somewhat, is the Chinese capabilities in the command and control are now integrated between conventional and nuclear. So you think there is a conflict going to happen over Taiwan? What is the likely target of the Americans? The likely target of the Americans is going to be to incapacitate the Chinese command and control. But if you incapacitate it, what would it make? Why should the Chinese infer that you're only going after the conventional capabilities rather than nuclear capabilities? All right. However, and clearly when the Chinese the Chinese feel that satellite capabilities are so germane to the American war deployment to run for situational awareness, communication, and other capabilities, then clearly if they go after them, those are also some of the capabilities the American need for purposes of managing nuclear operations. I think that both sides are now increasingly aware of that prospect. By the way, one issue, and I'm sure the senior officer here in the front row understands, is that historically the institutional divides between cyber and nuclear and conventional and so on were such that there wasn't dialogue between those constituencies, but the level of classification was so high that there was total compartmentation. So the people doing nuclear operations did not understand what cyber can do to them, and so on and so forth. I think one of the challenges we're now facing is to say, look, cyber now cuts across everything. And as a result, you need the cyber people to be in the midst of this. And by the way, from a bureaucratic point of view, this is a huge issue. I mean, in terms of, compartmentation, secrecy, and all of that stuff, right? Because you were saying, now cyber in some ways has been more secretive than other areas. But in order to make effective use of it, both defensively and offensively, and understand how it affects future conflict, you actually need to integrate it and so on. And space is moving in that direction too. So, yes, there is still a possibility. I think it's unlikely because the awareness is growing and some measures are being put in place.
Let's open now the floor to questions from our colleagues and our students.
And our experts as well.
Any question? Okay, let's give to the panel one more chance to make either a comment or a question, and then we will end it up here. Konstantinos.
I'm deeply, absolutely. Anyway, I'm deeply concerned by what I've just heard about the lack of integration, the prior lack of integration between command and control of nuclear and cyber warfare, and now the complete integration, which means that you may have, sounds to me fairly easier for conflict to spill over. And this is really a worrisome development. You see, in the very first question that I asked Dr. Levite, I was quite skeptical. I revealed my skepticism regarding the all this talk about cyber warfare being so different from past modes of warfare. And I'm really worried now because it's all this talk about possible nuclear response to a cyber attack. The US doctrine has been steadily moving to that direction. Let's say if they dare attack some critical infrastructure, then we reserve the right to respond with nuclear weapons. Now, this is horrifying. On the other hand, we have the Russians. All this talk, officially denied, but still, there has been a lot of talk of a strategy of escalation to de-escalate. Let's say if conflict really gets hot, then we might detonate a nuclear device and then show everybody that further escalation is possible, so we will bring them back to their senses, etc., etc., etc. So on this note, I would like to record my my profound worry in this respect. That's about it. It began, you see, there was a lot of talk about destroying critical infrastructure through cyber attacks. Dr. Levite told us about the cascading effects. I mean, this was a very, very apt comment. All this integration of cyber warfare and nuclear warfare is nothing short of horrifying. Somebody may come up with something more pleasant, or something that's...
Following up on the same mood.
So all of them, they will see tonight Dr. Strangelove.
No, the question is, what is the threshold of war? Meaning hitting a critical infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure? Exactly. Exactly. What is a critical? How can we define the threshold of war? Because now, if we are debating nuclear, then we must be consistent and very concrete on our definitions. And I don't see how. I would very much like to hear your comment on that.
Andreas, any comment?
A last one. I would like your opinion on how do you see the ideas of active defense or defense forward that the U.S. Ministry of Defense has used in terms of, I don't know, legitimizing offensive cyber operations. Is it something that brings us closer to, let's say, the war, the triggering a war, or are we just playing with legal terms?
Eli, you have the last word.
Let me walk back for the issues that were expressed here, and somewhat more reassuring than some of the pessimism around me, but somewhat. So clearly, let's look at it for a second historically. The Americans were technologically superior. They leveraged it originally for purposes of being able to use the cyber domain to collect intelligence, conduct covert operations, and prepare for conducting warfare in that space in ways that were advantageous to the Americans. Okay. What has happened over time is clearly that some of this first mover's advantage has been lost. Okay, so now we have at least 30 militaries that have offensive cyber capabilities and so on. Even the Iranians have become a significant cyber player. The North Koreans are playing the game for multiple purposes, including for purposes of commercial theft and so on. And the American conclusion was that given this new phase, the number one priority is defense in peacetime. Peacetime defined as not war. It's not defined as peace, but not war. Okay? The number one is defensive. But that the only way to be defensive effectively is to infiltrate adversary networks. To be able to stop attacks against them, detect them, and stop them early on. And that's what they are doing full scale now. Clearly, when they then see the Chinese trying to do the same and the Russians do the same, they go crazy, right? So we are at a different phase now where the distinction between offense and defense is getting increasingly blurred. And I'm looking here at the gentleman that has to do this on a daily basis and so on. Yes, this is a big issue, a very big issue, the distinction between offensive and defensive. And whereas you can call it defensive, the adversary will call it offensive, and so on. And in fact, I think that if you're actually paranoid, which I think in some cases, particularly the Russians are, When you do not detect the infiltration, you actually are even more worried because you know it's there. You think it's there, but you haven't found it. So it's even, you know, this hyperbole is there and so on. The reason I don't think that cyber is likely in most cases to trigger a war, because I think that ultimately, not only are the effects more modest than we had thought originally, right? So initially when the discussion of cyber warfare began, it was seen like, you know, the bolt from the blue, Hiroshima. I mean, it's not Hiroshima, then at least it's Pearl Harbor. I think now the realization is that the effects would be very problematic, but more moderate on the physical level, which was the thing that worried people a lot. And the defensive capabilities are there, and the uncertainty are there, and so on. So I think that what worries me, however, is that what this has actually done is actually expanded the space for cyber conflict to occur. Because what it actually means is, because you know it's unlikely to trigger war, you're actually saying this is an incredible zone for conflict that you can conduct with almost impunity. And everybody does it. Everybody does it. And so I think that the prospect of this triggering war is only relegated to the very extreme edge, and you're careful there. But in fact, you're actually trying to use it more liberally on a day-to-day basis to achieve even lesser goals than you had thought originally. Because the inhibitions are, well, if I know that this would not result in war, and in fact, I think we're dealing here with a very awkward situation where cyber has become the preferred way to conduct confrontation instead of war. So what happened is that it doesn't trigger war, but it's a way of fighting without triggering war. And some people would look at it very pessimistically and say, look, we now have a zone of actual fighting, except with electrons. And other people would say, look, this is a substitute. This is actually a firebreak. And this occurs at the level between doing nothing and conventional. This also occurs at the level of doing conventional with cyber rather than nuclear. So this firebreaker aspect of cyber, and like everything else, it's good, it's bad, it's mixed. It's not one or the other. It's all of the above. And a hell of a lot of depends on the specific circumstances and the behavior, which is why we're focusing so much on the question of, okay, so when you're using it, are you using it responsibly? Are you using it with the same principles of international law, of this discrimination and proportionality and necessity and so on? Or are you actually hiring mercenaries to do it indiscriminately, ceaselessly, attack critical infrastructure and so on? And that's, I think, where the biggest issue are in terms of the liberal use of cyber now for purposes and so on. But let me just to put things in perspective as a concluding note, for the Americans, if we take the Americans as an example, between doing nothing and going to war, there have been sanctions. Okay? Now, it's not just sanctions. You can do things by cyber. Those who do not have the economic might to impose sanctions of the nature the Americans can do are obviously lured more to cyber operations, right? So if the Russians declare sanctions on the United States, will those hurt? No. So cyber is a very attractive means to doing so, right? And that's, I think, where the reality we're in.
Well, I have been fortunate to listen to an exciting lecture. I think the audience, and especially the students, learn a lot. Is it any question here? Okay.
Yes, if I may, after your final conclusion, I was thinking, how would you define the term cyber action in terms of war? In a sense, I got kind of puzzled. For example, if you use sometimes cyber action in order to hack the ordinary weapons of the other side, in order to take control of the weapons, or if you hack it in order to avoid the other person to use them while you are attacking them, could we consider this to be a cyber action?
Well, let me connect to a point that came up earlier and I did not discuss.
Could you repeat for the audience?
Yeah, I'll try to repeat. So, if there is a cyber operation against a weapon system or weapon systems, is this an act of war or isn't it an act of war? I simplify a little bit your question, but I think I'll try through the answer to address it. And I think there was an earlier discussion of the challenge of attribution. Okay, and the challenge of attribution, as is common in the literature, is to say who is behind it. Okay, and who is behind it breaks down then in the following way: not only who conducted it, but who commissioned it. Okay, so the question was, all right, so it was the Wagner group that did it. Did Putin himself give the instruction, or was he aware, like the spy balloon recently from China? All right, who gave the instructions to do it? And as was pointed out here, if you actually are trying to look at the technical parameters alone, you don't have the answer. There you have a difficulty. Yes, you can say, yes, it's this company in China that is producing this type of balloons for purposes of collection of information, right? Did they deliberately send it over this area of the United States to spy over nuclear facilities and so on and so forth? And did they deliberately aim to do it ahead of a summit that the foreign minister of the United States was supposed to meet the foreign minister? You cannot give that answer, all right, based on, and so on, and who approved it. Was President Xi even knowledgeable that the Chinese were actually conducting those type of spy operations over the United States, over nuclear facilities, and let alone over this specific time? So my point is that the whole notion of trying to interpret what, not who conducted it, but even more importantly, what was the driving force behind it, is a very treacherous field. But typically what has happened as a result is there is a significant effort on the intelligence side to try and come up with answers. And one reason that you can see that the Americans were right about what was going to happen in Ukraine. They clearly had some very good sources and so on. I can give you some other examples of recent times where it's actually, the effort is trying to understand the motivation behind it. Now, let me draw the sort of focus on the specific issue. If you detect some worms in your weapon system, okay, first, some penetration of your weapon system. Clearly, the default option would say they're trying to learn more about the technical specifications of that capability, right? That is, if all you see is that they went into the system and they went through the system and they tried to exfiltrate, that's the professional terminology, some information about that capability, okay? Now, obviously, if let's say that you have patriots in Greece and there are patriots in 100 different countries as well, now even in Ukraine, and so on, and you see a penetration and so on. If the exfiltration has taken place in so many other places and so on, it's kind of less credible that this was actually the motivation. So you're trying to say, well, but they know everything there is to be known about it. Maybe this patriot has been modified, whatever, and so on. So that the answer may not be satisfactory. Okay. If you actually see that after actually exfiltrating the information about that specific system, they maintain presence there, okay, then, and they clearly, you get a sense that what they have in mind is the capability, maintaining a capability to neutralize that system. And maybe not just system, through that system to influence others. Then you begin to suspect that there is offensive operation behind it. And then you're asking yourself, what scenario do they have in mind in which they would try to achieve that impact on your systems? So, in essence, this whole field, Athanasios, you have to add another area of the specialization, cyber forensics, is an extremely important area of what we're all going through, where you're trying to put together this effort. What is the biggest problem? It takes time, and it takes effort. So to come forward, and now the issue is even bigger than that, because sometimes you see an anomaly, and you don't know whether it's a design flaw, it's a human error, it's a natural cause, or it's intentional. And if it's intentional, is it intentional by criminals? It's intentional by a state. And if it's intentional by a state, and so to go through this very elaborate process of elimination of what is the motivation behind it is a time-consuming process. Now, you would say, well, that's what we pay their salaries for. However, if this happens in crisis, the mindset changes. What is the default interpretation? If I detect, maybe it's been there for 3 years, I didn't detect it. But if I detect it in crisis, my mindset says, they're preparing for something offensively. And therefore, not only is it the forensic issue, but the contextual aspect that is very important.
Let's all thank Dr. Levite and the panelists for this great discussion. Thank you very much, Senator.